So moving on over to the controller layer, there are two different aspects of the controller layer within Liferay that we need to take a look at in regards to actually overriding the controller layer. The first aspect is going to be about struts. Now, struts is kind of a older technology, but we'll still talk about it since Liferay still uses it behind the scenes. So as mentioned, two different ways or two different concepts we need to cover. The first one is struts, and the second one is MVC commands. So we'll talk about the legacy one first with struts. So struts is a framework that helps enforce MVC. Right? We've been using struts for quite some time. Right now we're using struts version 1.3. As time progresses, we have been converting a lot of our struts actions, or what struts is being implemented for, into what we call MVC action commands. Again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. So some of the applications in Liferay that is still using struts, we have the knowledge base, blogs, documents and media are a couple of the big ones here within this list, but this list shows a lot of different applications are still using struts. So with that in mind, we're going to cover some of the basic aspects, basic concepts of struts. So there are 4 big parts to struts. Let's go ahead and talk about each one. So we're going to start off with the action servlet. So the action servlet, what ends up happening is there are specific URL parameters that might be entered. And these URL parameters will trigger specific struts or action servlets. And then those servlets will go off and do something. Now, the whole defining of which URL pattern invokes which servlet or action servlet is defined within a file called web.xml. So within web.xml, you can take a look at, again, which action servlets will be triggered by which URL patterns. Alternatively, we also have these things called action paths. Action paths, once triggered using, again, a specific URL pattern, will then forward to a specific class or the controller layer. So that class will then do something. Which action paths or URL patterns invoke which controller or Java classes is defined within struts config. So URL pattern and action servlets, web.xml. Action paths and which class they're going to call, struts config.xml. Now the action controller is the one who's actually doing the hard work, the heavy lifting. So when an action path sends us to a specific action controller, that action controller, being a Java class, will then do something. Typically, the something will be your CRUD operations, when you update something or when you delete something. So action controller is the actual class, Java class, doing something. Now the action form, what the action form kind of does is it creates a relationship between the classes that we're going to and then where we're going to go afterwards. What ends up happening, or what the action form or bean is doing for us, is after we perform a specific action, we can then be sent off to the UI. So, right, action path sends us to a specific Java class. That Java class performs an action, and then the action form will then send us over to a specific JSP most of the time. And that JSP is the view layer. So the view layer is going to be implemented using a JSP. So action path sends us to a specific controller class. Controller class finishes. We're then sent off to the view layer implemented by JSPs. And this can be defined in 2 different places, either strutsconfig.xml or tilesdef.xml. So two different places we're able to check out the relationship between what happens in the controller layer and how that brings us over to the view layer. Let's go ahead and give an example of struts. So over in our JSP section, we might have a specific action URL. It has a name called struts action, and then the value could be something like layouts admin edit layouts. Right, and so over in the struts config.xml, we can have a specific path /portal /edit layout. Let's pretend over in the JSP side, this the mapping is the same. So once the specific action path is triggered, it's then going to call the edit layout action class. So the edit layout action class does something, whatever that something may be. And after that, this is where we'll have some additional configuration. So some things are happening right between these two Java classes. Once those things are done, we can have a tilesdef.xml say, once you are done with this specific definition name, we are then going to send you over to this JSP to be rendered. In this situation, portlet.jsp is going to be the JSP rendered after our Java class is finished. So we have a diagram here to kind of show us all of the different ways or how we can end up visualizing these concepts. So we can start off over in the client, and they might be clicking some links here and there, and whatever links they click might generate the URL, and there might be specific URL patterns along the way. These URL patterns can be defined, for example, in web.xml. So specific URL pattern is met. We're then going to be forwarded, or we're then going to evaluate with this specific URL pattern which action is going to be called. Now this can also be defined down here in strutsconfig.xml. So strutsconfig.xml may see something along the way of, oh hey, this action, once it's done, right, we can then call a specific JSP down in the tilesdef.xml. Tilesdef.xml will then say, after the action is done, we're then going to send you off to display this specific JSP. So this is kind of this diagram here in a nutshell. So with all of that being said, how in Liferay are we able to override some of our own struts actions? Now before we do, we have to kind of further elaborate on struts actions. In struts, or more specifically in Liferay, our actions can fall under two separate categories. This could be a struts action that is performed by Liferay itself, or a struts action that takes effect within a specific application. So either Liferay or an application that we're working with can have a struts action. So if we're overriding a specific struts action, first thing we need to determine is this struts action for an application or for Liferay? Once we do, we're then going to find our action path over in strutsconfig.xml. So once we have the action path that we want to modify, we create a Liferay module project using the API template. We'll then create a new component, creating a new struts action component. We'll then define the struts action path that we're going to be overriding, and then override the method of this specific struts action. Down here below are a couple links that you can click on that'll show you our struts config and tilesdef.xml for easy reference. Some additional information can also be seen. If you want to see an example, you can head over to the Liferay Blade sample repo, where we have a couple of examples over there. So let's go ahead, we'll work on our own exercise of overriding a struts action within Liferay, and the one that we're going to be looking at is going to be when we log out of Liferay. So in this exercise, what we're going to do is when we log out of Liferay, it's going to redirect us to a specific URL. So that's going to be the functionality that we are going to be implementing in this example. Going through the steps, again, very similar to what we have done before. We're going to create a Liferay module project using that API template as a sort of generic template, right? Create a new component using the Struts in Action template for the component wizard. We'll then look for that specific logout action path so that we can add it to the component's property element. Right? Implement the method or override it, and then we'll deploy and test this out. So let's go ahead with those steps in mind. Let's take a look at what this is going to look like in Liferay Developer Studio.